Welcome
Thank you.
back, everybody, to another episode of Rebellious Wellness Over 50. My guest today is David Zemach Burson, and he is going to talk to us all about Feldenkrais. David's been doing this for 50 years, and that sounds like expert level to me, which is why I wanted to have him on. I don't know if you listening know about this modality. I remember hearing about it back in the 70s, maybe. And then, as I was talking to David earlier, I think yoga just took out all the oxygen in the room for any other modality but I'm here to say that I think we should give it a spin. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to meet you.
Thanks. Why don't you first give the listeners, tell them what it is. What is this modality? And how is it different from other ones that we may be more familiar with?
The Feldenkrais method is very unique and very different from any other modality that I'm aware of. And the essential difference is that we're taking advantage of what is known as the neuroplasticity of our brain.
Hmm.
That is the ability of our brain to change over our lifespan. And the Feldenkrais method accesses the learning capacity and the learning potential of our brain. So it's not about exercising this or that muscle. It's not about, I don't know, improving your jogging or resistance. It's not speaking directly to the musculature. It's more speaking directly to the ways in which the circuitry of our brain and nervous system facilitate movement. So if you look at the brain in terms of what it is occupied with, there's the vision center and the hearing centers of our brain, et cetera, et cetera. The largest concern by far of our brain and of neural activity is movement. Movement is the foundation, I would say, of learning. I think that's distinctly unique. Every, almost any form of physical improvement is involved with effort, efforting,
Mm.
doing more, trying harder, and getting better. And this has absolutely nothing to do with accessing these capacities, these unique and almost magical capacity that our brain has. And the reason I say magical is because when we access them, change happens very quickly. Now, what do we mean by change? We mean that we are able to move more easily, more comfortably, that we have less pain, that we're able to do what we want to do with less effort, which is, of course, important as we are getting older.
Mhm.
And I can testify to that. I am more than 3/4 of a century old, and yet I have no pain and I can move easily and comfortably. And if I do get in trouble, I have the tools that I need, of course, to get out of trouble
Mm.
because there's always trouble. The trouble is looming on the horizon one way or another for all of us.
Mhm.
But it's what tools do we have when we do have stress or an injury or anxiety and these difficulties, which are, I think, a an assured part of living.
I want to come back to this in a minute, but I read on your website that you were the first person in the US to be trained in this method. Is that correct?
I was among the
Among the
first.
first. And where did it originate?
It originated with a physicist named
Wow.
Dr. Feldenkrais, Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais. And Dr. Feldenkrais lived his life three places, three kind of epochs of his life: Paris, London, and Tel Aviv, Israel. And he himself had an injury. He was very active. He was a judo man. He was the highest ranking for a few years. He was the highest ranking non-Asian in the world in judo and became injured and was unable to walk. And before there were the kinds of very brilliant surgeries that we have today for when you have bad knees, let's say, or bad hip joints. After being told that there was no help for him, he set about trying to figure out how to solve the problem. It just became taking more and more of his time. So by the 1950s, he was devoting himself completely to this idea. What idea? The idea that movement is something that has been learned. And if we can understand how the brain learns, and if we understand that the brain does have this extraordinary capacity to learn, we can learn how to move in new ways that don't aggravate or cause discomfort, pain, etc. Usually, for most of us, we learn to adapt to our infirmities, to our pain. We take it as part of living.
And aging. There's a conversation that this is what happens at your age, which is my least favorite sentence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You think, oh, I'm older, and so I'm going to feel this. But the fact that I'm feeling uncomfortable or I'm moving with pain, oh, that's normal. And I just, what? I accept it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessary. It's no matter what age we are, we have the ability to improve. No matter what age we are, we still have the same ability to learn. It doesn't feel like it, but the same capacity that we had when we were 25 learn. So it's just that exercise, in other words, repeating a movement over and over again, does not access the brain's ability to learn.
What would be like why we don't have to think every time we go down the steps? Because it's on autopilot, right? We've already understood how to do that. The brain doesn't have to get engaged in that action.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I guess if we're compensating, let's say we're leaning a little because we have a hip pain on this side, and we keep doing that, then the brain checks out. You're just going to keep doing that, and I'm fine with it.
Because one of the most useful capacities of our brain is that of developing habits. And the brain is not distinguishing between something being a good habit or a bad habit,
If only.
or that the habit is rooted in trauma, physical trauma, psychological trauma, emotional trauma. The brain excels at developing habits and adapting to what is. So then, what do you need in order to change something that's been a habit of a lifetime, right? Because what would the stereotyped, say, physical therapy approach would say? Just stand, look, if you have your head here and you elongate yourself here, and now just walk around like that, that's good posture. Am I right? Or am I
Yeah.
right? This is good posture. This is correct posture. And if you just walk around with that correct posture, your feet will feel better, your knees will feel better, whatever it is. Or they might say, oh, it's your knees. Well, let's go in and we're going to manipulate your knees and do this, which is very short sighted because we aren't a collection of parts. This is well, I would say a reductionistic way of looking at things, but appealing about thinking, oh, you have pain in your knee, so the problem must be in your knee.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have pain in your shoulder. The answer must be in your shoulder. But it's a completely, this might sound too radical, but it's a relatively fallacious way of thinking. Of course, if things get bad enough, then you need knee surgery, right? But long before that, if one had simply changed, been able to change the habits of moving and sitting, habits of acting, habits of responding to space, to people, the knee pain would never have occurred. But
So would you say
I
that
feel like
would you say then that if somebody, for instance, my husband had one knee replacement, a total knee replacement surgery, and my girlfriend went to her doctor and said, is it time? They both had this response from their doctors, come back in a year. Maybe a year is too late before surgery. I don't know. But it sounds like what you're saying is we arrive with certain bad habits or work. I stood on my feet for 30 years as a chef. I used my hands. So certain things are a little bit unhappy. He worked outside for many years. His knee was unhappy, arthritis, whatever they want to say about it. Do you think that once you show up with a pain, though, your modality can help reverse it, I would say, what we're doing that's causing
I
the pain?
have absolutely no doubt. Absolutely no doubt. And the beautiful thing is, the name of my website is Feldenkrais Access. The beautiful thing is that, and we have to, again, just one little thing of nomenclature, it's, we call what we do lessons instead of exercise. And the reason we call them lessons is to make that distinction, really enliven that distinction, that we're speaking to the learning centers of the
Oh,
brain.
yeah, interesting.
Something is changing in terms of the way the neurons are firing rather than an exercise, which implies, I think, if we would look it up in the dictionary, repetition.
Right. And for many people, it also implies something they're going to hate. Oh, I've exercised before. I can't stand
That's
that.
right. That's
It
right.
hurts when I do that. Yeah.
And it implies something that you said earlier, mindlessness, right? And some people have taken to calling Feldenkrais lessons mindful movement. So, what does that mean? That means we're not mindlessly repeating over and over again certain movements, but we are attending to ourselves. We are sensing, feeling ourselves as we move.
Hmm.
And the reason that I can appeal with confidence to people with pain is that we don't do anything that invokes the pain,
Hmm.
that elicits the pain, evokes it.
Which is going to come as good news for some people because, of course, many of us grew up with the no pain, no gain, push past the pain, work through I mean, I've even been in yoga classes, just hold it to the point of pain. Why would I do that? But I think, and especially as we're aging, things that don't put us in those situations is a relief. This mentally, it's a relief to not feel like I'm going to have to do something that hurts just to get better.
I agree completely.
Hmm.
And if you think in the most simple way, what is pain? It's a signal from your brain to stop doing something.
Yeah.
It's a signal from your brain that something is injurious. And yet we have a physical culture that encourages, induces this movement towards discomfort.
Hmm.
And now say that what you're learning then is that life is difficult. You're learning that you're bypassing the brain and you're learning to be mindless and you're learning that you're not good enough and you're learning that you need to try hard. You're learning that in every endeavor in life, you need to work harder. And nothing could be further from the truth that each person listening to your beautiful podcast, the capacity to change, and that change can happen in one lesson. And one lessons are usually about 45 minutes long. Sometimes they're shorter, sometimes a little longer. And even just one lesson, one can feel the change. If one's difficulty is everyone talking about stress and difficulties, in one lesson, that stress can be reduced significantly. And of course, all the sundry pains that we have, I think that the Feldenkrais lessons are the most effective thing I've ever encountered for reducing discomfort.
You mentioned the word trauma earlier, and I'm currently listening to a book, The Body Keeps the Score. And it's now, I don't know how many years old it is, but I'm wondering if, so for the listeners, it's a book about a doctor who worked in psychiatry and medicine, and he got fixated on helping people that were physically still experiencing a trauma that had happened to them, say a soldier or a woman who was a victim of domestic abuse. And I'm wondering, because he does talk about, that's the whole point, the body keeps the score. And he went through a whole phase where he worked in pharmacology. It was new. There was drugs, antidepressive drugs, and this and that. But the most difficult cases were the people who physically reacted to even the slightest storytelling of what happened to them or a sound that was present when the thing happened to them. And I'm hearing you say that to me, this sounds like something that could intervene for these people.
This is absolutely right, and this has been ironically, a large area of interest for me, which is applying Christ lessons, especially to the problem of stress, anxiety, and trauma. Most people who have chronic stress and anxiety, I would say, have experienced trauma. They
Mhm.
may not remember it, recall it, but they've had it.
Mm.
And it could have been sometimes not only psychological, but it could have been a physical injury. I just finished teaching a course for people who have had severe head injuries,
Mm.
concussion, and it was extraordinary how many of them experience anxiety every day and have difficulties with sleep and TMJ problems and palpitations, et cetera, et cetera. And they will say, I was not raped, or I didn't suffer this, I didn't go through a war, but I did have 2, 3 concussions, right? But anxiety is very interesting because it's a dysregulation, as you're probably learning in this very good book, the dysregulation of our involuntary nervous system. So that is the part of our nervous system that regulates autonomic functions like digestion or our heart rate or our pupils. And if that trauma not resolved, and I would say if that head injury, which is very traumatic, or any traumatic injury is not remediated effectively, then we're stuck. We're
Mhm.
stuck as if that past event is in this present moment. And it's not the person's fault. It's the fact that it wasn't addressed in a way to bring the person back to being able to regulate themselves and to be so reassured, so deeply reassured that situation is not in the present moment.
Mm.
And so I have a whole series of, if I, not to make a crude pitch, but if you see my
Pitch.
website at Feldenkrais Access, you'll see that I've done a course for anxiety, 2 or 3 courses for anxiety. And actually, there's some free lessons at the site that I did. You remember COVID?
Oh, yeah, slightly.
So COVID was the impetus for the creation of Feldenkrais Access. As I'm sure it's been the impetus for, just as a lot of restaurants closed, a lot of new things began
Yes.
with COVID. And I was traveling all over the United States and Europe training new Feldenkrais practitioners. I had an institute in New York City, and that came to an immediate halt. And I don't know if you remember, in those first weeks, we were a country undergoing tremendous stress collectively. And so I did a series recorded with the help of some good friends who still work with me today. Recorded, I think, of the 5 short Feldenkrais lessons. In other words, more like about 30, 35 minutes long, called Soothe and Calm, and sent them out for free. And I think this was maybe April. So pretty at the, you'll see I recorded a series for improving breathing, for improving vision, for improving posture. But there's a couple of things there addressing very directly anxiety, and I'm
I'm
proud of that work.
As you should be. COVID got me back into not back into I didn't have a podcast before, but I used to do these online speaker events. And I had stepped away from health coaching because the market felt a little saturated with coach in a weekend kinds of things popping up. And I just said, I got to take a break. But then COVID hit and I had been lots of time to read. And I realized that the health of women in particular wasn't getting any better. Forget COVID. I'm not talking about the illnesses that were comorbidities and things like that, but the heart disease, diabetes was increasing. I said, I got to get back into this business. Like, I have to share some of the information, some of the things that I know. So like you, it was like, there's a need out there. You saw
And
it slightly
especially
differently.
needed by women,
Yeah.
especially because I think that we could make the case that women have undergo in their lifespan much more stress than men. I think that whole role of caretaking, even past the period of having children, I think creates enormous stress and depletion and a turning attention away from oneself. And these are all remedied or inherently in the Feldenkrais lessons.
You
Because as I
mentioned
said,
one of the lessons. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
hold the thought.
Yeah, I
I'll
will.
try to do it very quickly. We were making the distinction a few minutes ago between mindful and mindless, and that exercise is mindless. And Feldenkrais is mindful because the capacity to activate these learning centers of our brain are we do something sensing and feeling ourselves, we put this ability to change.
And somebody probably has to want to change. Is that an aspect of this? Or if I just start doing the lessons, will I find myself changing?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because your brain, in spite of you, your brain is seeking what is better. Your brain is seeking to stand in an easier way. Your brain is seeking to not have that. It recognizes the jaw tension versus not having it.
Hmm.
So whether you want to change or not, you will.
I like that idea because I know a lot of us don't want to change, but we want things to be different. This is the problem.
Or we're afraid
True.
of change.
Yeah. Might have to give something up. I might have to tell my friends I'm doing this. All the brain goes crazy. I want to go back to one of the lessons you mentioned about breathing, and you said something about sleep. And 201, I could probably interview 100 people at the age of 60, 65, 70, and they would say, oh, yes, I have plenty of times when I can't sleep. We don't need as much sleep as we age. And I just want to, first of all, that is not true. I've over the years remembered at some point laying awake at night that breathing is a good thing to calm. Is it the parasympathetic that gets
That's
us? So tell me a little bit about how your modality helps. It's not a breathing class per se, or is it? Is it alignment of the body, or is it literally learning how to breathe?
how to breathe because we all know how to breathe.
True.
It is that our nervous system's ability is, and why it's there is to choose between this environment and that environment, between safety and unsafety, to choose to run away from something or to move towards something. That's the most basic choice. So if you think of why a nervous system even exists, it's to have at least two choices, if not more, to create choice. And that increases our ability to survive. What was your question?
Breathing in your
Yes, yes.
modality, is it an
So we're not
alignment
teaching,
thing?
we're not teaching correct breathing.
Okay.
We're in the ability of the nervous system to distinguish between different ways of breathing. Earlier, we were talking about habit. Habit is fixed. So it means I have a fixed pattern of breathing. I have a fixed way of breathing. Either what I breathe deficiently or I breathe with effort, usually, often, or most people, and takes us back to anxiety. Most people who have had trauma, anxiety, or chronic stress, they breathe in such a way that they lift their chest when they inhale, pull their stomach in. Probably half of the population of the United States pulls their stomach in, especially because you're being taught all the time to tighten your abdomen, aren't you?
My mother would say, pull in your gut.
Exactly. And that is the way that we breathe when we experience stressful situation. A healthy person will begin to pull their stomach in, breathe in, it's called a paradoxical way. In other words, it's not using the diaphragm effectively. But why? Because if you breathe in that and you pull your stomach in, it activates and supports the sympathetic nervous
Mm.
system, the part of our nervous system that's what? That's right, fight or flight. Exactly. And so our approach to improving breathing is not to teach you a correct way to breathe, because even if it's the correct way to breathe or a better way to breathe, it's still not your choice. It's not, I think, to impose something on ourselves means that the learning is fragile because it always comes from outside and in. Oh, I should do this with my shoulder, or that with my shoulder, or this with my head. That's right. And then you meet life, you encounter life. And what happens? You go back to those old, tried and true habits, the
Mhm.
way that I know myself. And so breathing is such a basic function and so tied to what we were talking about, the involuntary nervous system. When people have stress, again, if the stress isn't remediate effectively or the injury isn't remediated effectively, then we quickly adopt that breathing that's related to that basic involuntary response to stress or injury. Injuries can provoke the sympathetic system to develop a habit. And why is it so easy for the sympathetic activation to become a habit? Because it's life and death, isn't it? When it's a trauma, and that's what its function was, how it evolved from the more primitive times, from long before human beings. That sympathetic system was that organism would freeze and not move
Mhm.
in the hopes of not being noticed, or it
Mhm.
would run, it would move
Yeah.
in the opposite direction away from the predator. It's a very reliable, tried and true system that unfortunately, because it's part of an alarm system, unless you intervene and say, okay, we can turn off the alarm,
Mm.
unless you have the mechanism for turning off the alarm, it stays on. And
Yeah.
over time, and then they become habits of holding my head forward and down, habits of rounding my back. These are all sympathetic system responses. And then it maintains that sympathetic, what's called dominance.
Fascinating. I want to tell
I
the
find,
listeners again about your website, the name of it. Do you want to spell it so I don't get it wrong?
sure, Feldenkrais is Feldenkrais, and then access, ACES.com. And there's lots of free resources there.
And you do live classes with a
And I do
certain
live
topic in
classes.
mind.
That's
Okay.
right. In January, I started a whole new series on the
Shoulder,
shoulders.
I have it right here. Shoulder Rescue,
Shoulder.
it's called.
Yeah.
And you can do it live or online.
And then later in the year, I'm teaching a long series of lessons that can be done sitting in a chair.
Oh, good.
Because for a lot of people, just lying on the floor can be, as we get older, can be less than appealing.
It's the getting up for some people.
That's right.
I'm
That's
not
right.
laughing at my husband. I love him dearly, but we just put up the Christmas tree and we have to put the hose in the dish to get the water in, and he gets down
Yeah.
there. And then it's okay, this is it for December. I'm just going to stay down here because his knees still hurt. The one knee is not so bad, but he has another knee. And of course, usually we roll over onto our knees to get up. So if you ever need him, he'll be
Well,
under the Christmas tree.
tell him that he can have free access if he wants to the knee series.
Okay. And you said that you were going to give me a link that I can put on the podcast
I
page
will. I
for
will.
some extra goodies for the listeners.
I
Um,
will. I promise.
Great. This has been fascinating. It's easy to listen to you and understand what you're talking about. So I thank you for that. And I appreciate your time and thank you for being with me.
And thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So people, Feldenkrais Access and .com for free things and classes you might want to sign up for. And I, for one, am really interested in, there's a class for helping your hands, believe it or not, that have nothing to do with exercising your hands. Fascinating to me. And I hope that I'm like some of the listeners. I really want things to be easier as I get older. I don't want to push as
Amen.
hard. I don't want to run up hills as much in the way of taking care of my body, right? I still sometimes like to get on my bike and take a hard class, but I think being gentle with our bodies is a gift that we could embrace more as we age, rather than pushing against the aging process and the things that don't go the same as they used to. So I think that your work is going to be something I look into more. Thank you
Amen.
again, people. Thanks for
Thank you.
listening. I will be back next week with another fabulous guest.